Firstly, I've got to say thanks very much for the invite to speak today. I remember when John first approached me, he said, "Hey, Shorty, could you do me a favour and come and speak for 30 minutes on the Air Force's contribution and its views and analysis of Afghanistan, Iraq, 2001 to 2014. I'll skip ahead to a slide so you might see. When I sat down with a few of my friends and said, look, I know I'm going to offend someone because my perspective on the world was very much the CRC, and I'll get onto that in a second. I'll give a bit of a 101 on CRC as well. You know, I had about half a dozen phone calls from my Air Force colleagues sort of lobbying me early in the piece when the media stuff started going out. And I thought I can only lose here. So what I thought, rather than giving you, you know, a very lightweight tap across the top of what the Air Force did in Afghanistan and Iraq, I will focus on my knitting. And my knitting is the Control and Reporting Centre. It's something I'm really proud of, and hopefully that'll come out today. The way I'm going to make it relevant to this conference, I hope, is I think it's fantastic, the lessons we learn, and particularly I see a lot of green in front of me. That is just wonderful. You'll never get me talking as a parochial blue guy. I'm a joint guy, always have been. It's really good to get these lessons out. But the difference is with these capabilities that I'm going to talk to you about is they are very high-end, very technical, very niche, and very much the future of where the ADF's going. And I'm in the back of my head, it's probably a dirty word here, but I'm talking 5th gen. And I think we shouldn't be shy to pull the lessons out of these deployments. And there was a bunch of these very small, very niche, but very powerful deployments, and I'm going to talk you through those today. I would like to say, while that slide's up, 2 things. One is, for those who have been serving for a long time or observing the ADF for a long time, if I put a slide like that up 20 years ago, you'd scoff. You know, you look at the range of capabilities in there, you know, I'm not going to single any out because I'll get in trouble. But, you know, the Heron, the stuff we did in the AOC was magnificent, you know, and I'm not talking just about the operators, the INT community, the role that they played, and what we did in the Air Force to fundamentally change the way we do business as a direct result of that is fantastic. But the thought is, would we have done this 20 years ago? So it's nice to be standing here saying, well, I don't care, but we did it between 2001 and 2014. The other point, I need to really acknowledge the amazing Air Force people, and I'll do this all the way through, but while that slide's up, we've deployed thousands of Air Force people to the Middle East in various capacities. As both an ex-Air Force member, obviously, an ex-Air Force member, but an observer of Air Force evolution, I was proud at every single step of the way, and to see some of the performance of the individuals, you know, every bit the great tradition of your ADF warrior. And I just think it's hats off to the people that have been there, that are still there, and are yet to go. And before I jump back into my swim lane, for those of you that really want a good read, I had a chat with the Air Force historian while I was making up my mind which way I might approach this task, and right at the end of our sort of hour-long conversation, he said, oh, by the way, I'm writing a book. And I thought that might be relevant both to this presentation, but more importantly for those of you that want a good read. That's the working title. It's due out in December this year, and I'm assured it's on track for that. Okay, back to my, my swim lane. I'm really pleased to be able to stand here and talk about the CRC deployment, Control and Reporting Centre. It was very much a niche deployment. And as an Air Force guy that looks like that when I deploy, I tend to get not often invited to speak about air power, and I tend to get lost below the horizon when we start talking about fast jets, big bombs, etc. And that's okay, I've got no chip about that. I believe, though, there is a lot to be learnt with a bit of examination on capabilities such as this. And in fact, I'm talking about the CRC is because that's my bread and butter. I could be talking about the air traffic control capability we deployed, and interestingly, Dan's lessons that he just pulled out, there's a lot of overlap between some of the niche capabilities that we had. I know that many people in this room visited the CRC while it was deployed, and it was something that we always welcomed. But there's also people that don't really know what a CRC does, and we learnt this lesson a lot. It's really worth our while spending a few minutes just talking about the capability. And I present you this basic overview as OC 41 Wing at the time. 41 Wing owned all the bits and the people and all the rest of it that comprise a CRC. I had this thing called TechCon, which I learned a lot about as the deployment rolled on. I still have the scars for that. And I was also the lead Air Force planner for this deployment. I was OC 41 Wing for a bit under 4.5 years. The tour was doubled up to take care of this deployment. A CRC will include sensors, in our case the big TPS-77 radar that you can see it, you don't need me to point out, plus all the other deployed radars that were through theatre were connected into that centre. Inside the Demouche tent, the big tent there, it's an operations facility. We have a series of ISO containers with what look like just standard computer displays which do all the fusion of data from all around Afghanistan in this case, or wherever we happen to be. I think there was about, from memory, 12 consoles, but that's multi-configurationable however we see it. We generate out of there an air picture of the totality, in this case the totality of the airspace throughout Afghanistan. It wasn't localised. And that is pushed out into whoever wants it. In our case, the KAOC was our primary customer. We also had some link capability, notably Link 16, which we put together about 3 or 4 weeks before we actually stepped offshore. And we had communication facilities. We also had them scattered around theatre that we were operating via US SATCOM. The role is really simple. Our role was to make sure we had the right aircraft with the right weapons and the right fuel in the right place at the right time. Our priority, very proudly, was to support the troops in contact. Some interesting stats, because I like stats. Firstly, I'll talk about these as we go through, but the first operational deployment in 50 years, that throws up some unique challenges. Deploying around Australia is kind of a deployment compared with the rest of the world, putting stuff in an aeroplane and flying it around the world. But as you would all know, the best laid plan of a deployment overseas into an operational environment doesn't always go to plan. You can't script it quite as well as you can a domestic deployment. Such things as getting our kit ready to go on 4 C-17s and having 2 IL-76s turn up. That was an indication that we better be a bit flexible. There was no real culture of deployment. We thought there was, but interacting particularly with JOC and not so much the joint warfighters, that was pretty easy. But getting our head around the real nuances of C2, etc., we were on a pretty steep learning curve. There was no better capability of this type on the planet at the time, including the operators. We have full-time professional operators that train at the highest end of this capability that you can on the planet. The US at this stage were a Marine Corps and a US Air Force rotation. They'd been doing it for a long time. They were tired. They were well into their reservists and their National Guard guys. We had a fundamentally different approach to it, and their kit was getting tight. 196,000 sorties in 23 months, 24/7. That is just a big number. I did 34 years in the Air Force, and I had 3 short deployments out there. 196,000 sorties. I doubt I saw half that in 34 years. So the guys that went out and spent their 2 or 3 deployments of 4 to 6 months each in those rotations would have seen more work than probably we've ever done in the history of this capability. So it was an enormous amount of work. 7,000 ticks, these sort of numbers make your eyes water. 7,000 ticks, troops in contact, and that was our primary reason for being there. And that's something I said we're particularly proud of. There's some particularly good stats. I won't bore you with the details, but a capability like this, I'll make up a number because who knows, about 1,500 single point failures in this capability. And we walked away, I guess at the end of it, we mopped our brow and said that's a really good result. But it's a testament to the techs and to the kit that we bought in the first place and how we took it over there. And I guess that's my bottom line. I'm a bit of a broken record. When someone gives me an opportunity to talk about the CRC, so few people know that it existed, and yet it's something that we should be really proud of, and I certainly am. Some key points on the timeline. I'll let you read through the timeline. I know there's a few people in the room that experience this timeline. Firstly, our recce team. I'm going to jump down into the weeds here a little bit, but that's okay. Our recce team was seriously underdone. We're talking about pulling out some real lessons to stick them on the record here. We were a CRC. I mean, frankly, no one really knew what a CRC was. And on the same day that we got announced that we were deploying, so did SOTG in 2007. So we were, in one sense, we just piggybacked onto them, which made our admin and our planning a bit easier. And they're all good guys, of course. On other sense, you know, we went to places around Afghanistan that we were never going to go again as part of the recce, you know, which is just... And when we wanted to get to the place we really needed to do, like pour a bit of concrete and, you know, measure out stuff and have a look at radar sites and things, that was a bit hard. So, and also right at the end, someone talked about OMD before. That's a real lesson for us, and for all of those high-end technical capabilities that still lie ahead of us. We had our capability, I think it was cut from about 8 down to 5, right on the gravy stroke, and we lost our loggy. So who goes on a recon on a base the other side of the world without a logistics officer? I mean, just crazy. So we learn a little bit, and we got to speak up a bit, of course, and we got to stamp our feet every now and then, and accept a few bruises. That's okay. Even though this is an operational deployment, it came as a bit of a surprise to a lot of people that we have airworthiness and battleworthiness requirements. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but fundamentally you cannot operate when you've got civil aeroplanes on your frequencies and you're deconflicting civil and military airspace. You have to have your airworthiness tick, and you have to have individual operators have to be compliant. They have to be trained, they have to be qualified, and someone has to certify them. It sounds like a terribly bureaucratic process, but it's necessary. And when that took a bit longer than people wanted it to take, that used to get people a little excited. And again, it was about the OMD, reflecting on the OMD. Our footprint was 75 personnel. And when we put our team in to replace, that 75 personnel became 150. And that was for a few days. That was okay. Most of our guys would get in, hand over and go. And then we'd have the operators who actually had to get up to speed, and that might take them a week, and then it might take 3 weeks. It might take, around about that point, the CO was normally, you know, trying not to answer the phone. And that's just the nature of these capabilities. 24/7 mission for 23 months. None of the kit that we have was designed for that sort of operations in that sort of environment. It's a harsh place for electronic gear. And the fact that we got the stats that I put up there before was just phenomenal. Now, we had battleworthiness provisions in place. Our language, force protection looks after the people, airworthiness looks after the aeroplane, battleworthiness looks after the mission. So we needed places, if we broke, or if the radar broke, or if an operator broke, we needed to be able to farm that mission out, because frankly it was going on without us. It didn't matter. So we needed to have that battleworthiness in place. But as it turned out, we didn't need a whole lot of it. 24/7, this thing didn't miss a beat. Let me give you my perspective. I like showing maps, particularly to green folks. It's good. This is how we see the world. CRC folks, same as Wedgetail folks, I'll point out there that we're one of the same. Look down, the God's eye view of the planet. That's how we operate. In Afghanistan, at the time, the airspace was divided into 3 agencies. There were 3 regions controlled by 3 different agencies. The RAF had the western area. BMA is Battle Management Area. Up north was our RAAF, until the US AWACS came along to make our life easier. And we had the centre one. Big point out of this, and this is another point that's probably not known, certainly not understood. The primary command and control agency in air in Afghanistan for 23 months was the RAAF through the CRC. So the RAF and the US AWACS worked to our CRC, we worked to the KAOC. And that's how the skies were managed for 23 months, which again, I'm pretty impressed with. C2. This is very, very simplified, and I think brave for an ex-RAFI to stand up and talk C2 to you guys. But the reason I do it is it was key, and there's more lessons in this C2 than you can imagine. It's firstly, C2 means so many different things to so many people. You guys don't need to be told. If you get it right, it makes life a lot easier. If you get it wrong, it makes life quite complex. There's 2 main issues for us, and I won't touch on the National Command because Dan already has, but the 2 main issues. Firstly, we work real-time, absolute real-time, for 24 hours a day for 23 months. So really the voice that we care about is in the KAOC, because the KAOC will give us resources, the KAOC will give us aeroplanes. If we're short of fuel, or if we've got the wrong nationality of aeroplane at the wrong fuel stop or whatever, it's the KAOC that fixes that stuff for it. It's not a brief back to whoever. It's real time, and if it's not real time, then it doesn't matter to the CRC, pretty much. I know there's a few exceptions to that. So it took a while for us to get staff officers around, their heads around the fact that the CRC was a real thing, dealing with real aeroplanes with real human lives at the end of the stick. I also mentioned the other point I've got is this TechCon thing, which when I was told, you're a lead planner and you're also got TechCon, very complex bit of kit, logistics chain on it was quite substantial, the human resource on it to keep that humans up to it, things like Link 16, it was new to us at the time, we were pulling Navy guys out. It was a very fragile, not fragile, that's the wrong word, it needed close management to keep that capability going. And of course, in my eyes, I thought I was the expert in all this stuff, and that must have been what TechCon gave me, acknowledged my expertise. In actual fact, TechCon was quite a complex C2 arrangement that took us, I would suggest, a good few months to actually settle into the routine. I'm not going to talk much more about it except to say I'd be surprised, Dan mentioned it in passing, I'd be surprised if anybody that's talking about activities in the field doesn't raise C2, if not as an issue, certainly as a point of which we can learn from. There's a myriad of lessons at all levels. I did exactly the same as Dan, and there was no colluding. I spoke to a lot of the COs, I spoke to senior folks all around this capability deployed in theatre, in the JOC, etc. And I tried to harvest relevant lessons for both the conference, but more so for the longer capability, the book and all the rest of it. Because I genuinely believe that we need to learn lessons from these niche capabilities as much as we do from the major deployments. So the strategic lessons. I've listed the top 4 of each, and again, like Dan, there was about, I think we got to about several hundred when I said that'll be enough, and frankly, most of the lessons I was able to pull into being were tactical and of perhaps minimal relevance here. We talked before about the political value of some of the capabilities that we deployed, and I'm not talking here about the political decisions. I thought that was a conversation this morning that was good and it served its purpose. But from a guy, I guess maybe not necessarily in the field, but in the raise, train, sustain world, it was quite obvious to us that this capability was going to achieve a political impact, perhaps way beyond its operational impact. And what do we mean by that? So the capability that we have is niche. A niche capability is niche no matter what nation it's in, and the US in this regard were starting to hurt. Their capabilities in both the Marine Corps and the Air Force had been on multiple rotations, as had their people. Things were breaking, including their people, and frankly they just needed a break. And there was only 2 other nations on the planet that could service that desire. And they'd been talking to us for a couple of years about our level of capability, our level of certification and all the rest of it. This was a really good option, inside the wire, high-end capability with very qualified operators to give our US friends 2 years off. At the time it was only 1 year, none of us were surprised when that got extended to 2 years. But this was a capability that meant that force in the US could have a break and reconstitute. The second point I'll make is to take on a role like this, which impacted every aeroplane that flew in Afghanistan, including civil aeroplanes, and all our allied friends. We have to be a trusted agent. When you start talking on a radio and directing aircraft around in a combat environment, you have to be a trusted agent. Our operators must be known, our commanders must be known, particularly to the US and the UK. We have to have compatible, if not common doctrine and common procedures. And we must share a common language, including our tactical language. An example, things such as air battle management, tanking procedures, Link 16 doctrine, protocols, etc. You just can't learn that when you get to theatre. That has to be smooth, and the handover takeover has to take 48 hours, not 48 weeks. So my message here is simple, that the investment in high-end exercises such as Red Flag, which seem like a big deal, making our pitch blacks, etc., really complex, inviting the right friends to these exercises. As Dan said, having exchanges, Sharing notes, sharing education, sharing experiences is invaluable, because the word trust, when you get to theatre, when it is seamless, the voice on the radio might have a funny accent, but you know they're capable of doing the job, was absolutely critical at that strategic level. I say we also need to invest in education. This might actually be a slap in to myself. For some reason, we were surprised when we were prepping and when we went to theatre that nobody really knew what we did. And the intricacies of laying concrete and needing certain facilities and certain works done and certain access to remote sites and things like that seem to come as news to people. The real key message is this capability, again, like a lot of these niche capabilities, gets locked up a bit. It's not something we put on YouTube, and perhaps it is. It should be. We went out and spoke to a few people, but frankly, we didn't work hard enough on making sure that everybody in our chain, everybody that we needed to depend on, knew what we did. So we got service like everybody else, which is okay. There's a lesson learned. One of my takeaway messages is we've really got to move on past this one size fits all. There are capabilities here that they don't need to be different, they don't need to be special, they just need to be understood. In part, the big learning lesson for me was, well, I could have probably spent 3 or 4 months before we went seriously on the education trail. The most important lesson, and pretty much everything I ever did in my service career, this was the most important lesson, is that relationships are the key to success. Relationships are the key to interoperability, without a doubt. If you got the relationships right, then you can fix anything. Knowing, trusting, there's that trust word again. Everybody you need to know at all levels, this is probably tactical right through to strategic, is essential. We had Air Force officers as deputy Combined Force Air Component commanders and KOC directors, as well as valuing long-standing relationships between senior officers through the RAF, the ADF, the US Forces and the RAF. It was a really good aid in getting our local stuff done. And that local C2 arrangement, having an Australian capability that hasn't deployed for 50 years, turn up in theatre, own the whole airspace and have US and RAF OPCON to it, that doesn't happen if you don't know each other. And it emphasises again that point, again, that Dan was talking about knowing each other through courses and careers and exercises and the like. Our relationships into JOC, we had them, we developed them a lot better, a lot quicker. And that was, again, a learning point for us. Operational lessons. I mentioned this was the first deployment for 50 years, and noting that you move around Australia, if you go up to the northwest, that's more deployment than most capability around the rest of the world does ever. What became clear to us is we needed to know how to become a part of a JTF and how to educate, how to understand, how to deploy. We needed to develop a little bit of resilience in terms of that deployment stuff. And we learnt that very quickly. The mission rehearsal exercises were essential. This was the busiest operational airspace on the planet. There is no way to simulate it. So we took air task orders and airspace control orders, put them into our simulators at Williamtown. We fired that up. We had the very best mission rehearsal exercises you possibly could get. The US Air Force came over and looked at it and they thought, yes, they'll have one of those, please. So they took it away with them and they used it. Regardless of that, when we got our guys into theatre, just the sheer numbers of aeroplanes that were in the sky at any one time was simply beyond the capacity of people, very good operators, very good officers, very good troops. It was beyond their capacity. So maybe half a dozen of the 500 people we deployed just couldn't come up to speed. That's okay. That's okay. It's not good for them. It puts a hole in the capability that we have to fill, but ultimately we got to expect that when you go to the busiest place in the world, you get a sort of 7-day, 14-day handover. Some people are just not going to be able to cope. The OMD, 75-person footprint, which was reduced to 70 people by negotiation. Replaced a US footprint in the vicinity, I'm going to say 150, I believe it was a bit more than that. Most of us will go, yeah, but the US is always bigger because they can be bigger. Or in certain cases, the US also have a bit of redundancy built in, and we found we just didn't have it. If an illness ran through the camp, or if someone didn't come up to speed, as I've just said, you could have great big holes in the capability. But we were absolute slaves to the OMD. The OMD was right, and regardless of what you say, it's wrong. So you make sure that you get that number under the OMD. And someone else mentioned that before, and I absolutely think we need to look at that. Again, I'll say the one size fits all is not always the answer. I physically cannot put a high-end specialised niche capability in the field and 3 days later roll out their capability they're replacing. It's just not going to work. Tactical lessons, perhaps not surprising. Workforce sustainment, we were initially deployed for a 2-rotation, 12-month deployment. Sounds consistent. Once we were there, almost pretty shortly thereafter, we were extended, which we kind of expected. So, I'll confess we built this into our planning. No real surprises, but there was a lot of sustainment. There is a big difference in the niche capabilities sustaining for 12 months versus 2 years. All manageable, all able to be done, but concurrency challenges, etc., will really sort you out. I'm more than happy to talk more about workforce and OMD, etc., in questions, in breaks, or over a drink tonight. I've spoken to you about compliance, and I'll just note that the relationships is as important at the tactical level as it is at the strategic level and political level. I'm going to just give you 3 lessons to take away from this. After I've just said it's really great that I can stand here and talk to you about the CRC, and hopefully you can understand the perspective. I mean, it's great that you're going to know what a CRC is, but it's really now the next capability might be a deployed cyber capability or a deployed EW capability or whatever happens to be. It doesn't matter. These high-end, technically based C4 capabilities are going to become more and more common. We were really fortunate as an ADF and as a nation to throw something like this into the desert. It did a phenomenal job. We learned a bunch of lessons. We shouldn't be shy about pulling those lessons out and seeing what they look like in the future. Firstly, my overwhelming summary point is this was a magnificent deployment, 196,000 sorties. That's just a big number. Achieved some really great results, and it's one that we should be all aware of first and proud of second. And of course, just know about this stuff. It's important. Secondly, the commitment and professionalism shown by, it was about 500 people that went through, ADF members, not just Air Force, that deployed with the CRC, was just yet another example of the incredible people that we are so lucky to have in the ADF. And finally, we have lots to learn about deploying niche capabilities. OMD, one size fits all, we need to really think about that stuff. And these are going to become more crucial as we head down that 5th-gen path. And as I said, I just don't think we should be shy about discussing them. I reiterate to John and Marcus, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm more than happy to talk broader Air Force stuff to the level of my knowledge. I acknowledge the phenomenal commitment from Air Force over that time, and I was very proud to be part of it. So thank you.